Hey BookTube friends, it's Carrie. Thanks for joining me today. I do want to mention that I have reached over 200 subscribers, which is pretty phenomenal for a small BookTube channel like mine. So I just want to take a moment to thank each of you who has subscribed to my channel. It really means a lot that you guys tune into my videos, and each week I look forward to talking to you all in the comment section. So it is one of the things that I look forward to, so I appreciate that you guys are sticking around with me. So the first book that I read this week was Symphony for the City of the Dead, Dmitri Shostakovich and the Siege of Leningrad by M.T. Anderson. This book is a young adult nonfiction book, but it is extremely well researched. The notes section is very extensive, and the author also talks a little bit about some of the sources he used, because with some of the sources, you're dealing with people living under a totalitarian regime, and so they do have motivations for lying, primarily self-preservation, and so you do have to take that into consideration. The subject of this book is Dmitri Shostakovich's composition, the Seventh Symphony, which will become known as the Leningrad Symphony. And this symphony, at the beginning of the book, is being transferred on microfilm and being flown to the United States. And so the beginning of this book almost starts out kind of like a spy thriller, but it's really a biography of Dmitri Shostakovich that's woven into a World War II history. And it's very easy to read. It's very compelling. We are dealing with the Siege of Leningrad, which is the longest and most devastating siege in history, lasting almost 900 days. And so there are a lot of graphic tales of what people in Leningrad had to do to survive. They are in a unique situation because they are pretty much stuck between the Nazi regime and then their own totalitarian regime. So you will hear about atrocities that were committed by all different kinds of groups in this book, and you will also hear about cannibalism and citizens having to eat their pets and eat wallpaper and all sorts of things to survive. Just very impossible circumstances where people are forced to give up human dignity in order to just survive. What Dmitri Shostakovich does, in my mind, is when he creates this Seventh Symphony that is dedicated to the people of Leningrad, he's really giving them back their humanity. He's giving them back their human dignity, because when the orchestra in Leningrad performs this symphony, the musicians are starving, and some of the musicians do not even survive. Some will die during or after practices. It's just remarkable that people are capable of producing art in the most dire circumstances. One of the really interesting things that I found in this book was that there was a German scientist who was responsible essentially for estimating how long the city of Leningrad could stay alive. According to his calculations, they should not have survived. But one thing that science doesn't account for is attitude and just pure willpower and perseverance. We do get a little bit of insight into Stalin's delusions during this time period and how he just could not believe that the Germans were invading when they were. And during the Great Purges of the 1930s, 60 to 70% of the Soviet officers and 90% of the generals will either be executed or sent to a gulag. And so Adolf Hitler doesn't even have to lift a finger for that to happen. And so very interesting to see a lot of that play out. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know I just finished the book Chimes of a Lost Cathedral by Janet Fitch, which is the second book in the Marina M saga. And those books take us through the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War, and they are set in Petrograd. I enjoyed getting a greater look into the cultural and historical significance of that city. I didn't really know a whole lot about that city. I knew it was called St. Petersburg and that the name was changed to Petrograd so that they could drop the German Berg. and then after Lenin's death, it will be called Leningrad. But I really wasn't aware of the cultural and historical significance of this city because it really was the epicenter for a lot of your intelligentsia. A lot of the same poets, a lot of the same writers and musicians that I heard about in those two fictional books that I mentioned by Janet Fitch are mentioned in this book. And so for Stalin, this city really represents a threat because these are where your educated people are, and educated people always represent a threat to totalitarian regimes. While I was reading this book, I did actually go on YouTube and listen to the Seventh Symphony, and I would recommend that. It really kind of enhanced my reading experience, and I'm not someone who listens to that type of music, but I really enjoyed it, and even though I'm not really typically into that sort of thing, this book gave me a different lens to view World War II history through, and I can't say enough good things about it. There were, of course, lots of people who speculated about Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony and what exactly it meant. Was it actually defiance against Stalin's regime? And we will never really know that answer for sure, but you have to believe that people who are artists living under that sort of totalitarian regime just to create art is an act of defiance, because when you read this book, you'll see that no matter what artist produced, they were at risk pretty much at all times of being brought in for questioning, sent to a gulag, or even executed. Stalin will at some points critique people because they are too formalist and they are not producing art that is part of the realist movement. And when asked what the difference was between formalism and Soviet realism was, Stalin's response was, only the devil knows. So there you go. I think that anyone who survived this time period is extremely brave, and that's a triumph in and of itself. And of course, a lot of people will have to do things in order to survive, and those stories need to be told. So I would most certainly recommend this book. I think that if you are interested in World War II history at all, or you're interested in music, this would be a great read for you. And I learned a lot of things that I did not know. There were lots of diary accounts and personal anecdotes in this book that made it very riveting and compelling. And even though it is not necessarily a happy read, you know, we are talking about a siege that results in 1 million deaths, we do get to see the triumph of the human spirit. And I do want to read a little excerpt in this because they did specifically mention the Leningrad Public Library. So the Leningrad Public Library remained open during the siege, and it actually became a place for a lot of people to congregate. It says, people came to the library to read, even when weak from cold and exhaustion, one of the librarians explained. Some died in their places, with a book propped in front of them. We would carry the bodies outside, hoping that the trucks would take them away, but increasingly they simply left them in the snow. And the building was pretty seriously damaged, so the librarians actually had to crawl over rubble and retrieve books. And at one point, obviously, they lose electricity, and so they're doing this by lantern. And then when they run out of lantern oil, they do this by burning pieces of wood. The librarians also searched for answers to practical questions that were posed by city government officials. So alternative methods of making matches and candles, forgotten sources of edible yeast. And it was actually during this time that the library increased their collection because they were able to purchase books from people who were starving and trade for different things. Reading novels and writing diaries and poetry were surprisingly popular during the siege, especially when the circumstances grew particularly grim. Activities like these reminded people of another life and prodded them to remember the codes and routines of civilization in the midst of chaos. It allowed them escape when they were entrapped. As it happens, many famous Russian novels are quite long. This was a perfect time, some soldiers and civilians found, to read Crime and Punishment or War and Peace. And of course, we know during dire situations like this, books were often used as fuel for fires. But I found that part of the book particularly heartening, because as long as we have libraries, we still have civilization. And I think people will always seek out knowledge and seek out that escape. I know here on BookTube we often talk about reading as being, escapism, and I think this was a very extreme example of that. So obviously I loved this book and I would definitely recommend it. I know there are a lot of people on BookTube, in this little corner of BookTube, who are into Russian history and literature, so it may be something that they're interested in, or it may be something that they already know about, but I loved it and I would recommend it. The second book that I listened to this week was Elevation by Stephen King, and this is a story about a man named Scott Carey, and he is your standard good guy, but he's experiencing a little bit of a medical mystery. His weight is steadily declining, but he's not actually losing any mass. He doesn't look any skinnier, but the scale is reflecting that he is losing weight at an alarmingly fast pace. We follow that mystery along with Scott's attempts to try to make peace with his two neighbors. He has a same-sex couple that moved in his neighborhood, and these two ladies own a restaurant in town. And so it's really a story about Scott Carey trying to make friends. I did listen to this book while I was running, and there is a turkey trot race that occurs in the book, and I thought it was kind of interesting that I was running my 7-mile long run this week while I was listening to the part in the book that deals with the race. So I did enjoy that, and I think that has to do with the fact that I was actually running as the book was describing that event, so that made it kind of interesting. But I will say this was not a favorite King story for me, and this is a short little novella. I really wouldn't call it a mystery because you don't really get a lot of answers in the end. I will say it is a lighthearted, kind of heartwarming story, but it's definitely not horror, and it was okay. But it wasn't my favorite King, and it wasn't horror. Even with the medical mystery in this book, there wasn't really a whole lot of tension. So even though our main character, Scott Carey, consults a doctor and he ends up pulling in a couple of his new friends into this mystery, there really doesn't seem to be any tension or conflict. Things just kind of happen and they let them happen. So I'll leave it at that. It wasn't the worst book I've read, but I can't say I would recommend it. It is pretty short, so even if you don't like it very much, if you read it, it won't be a huge waste of time. But that's my reading week. If you guys have read either of these books and you have any thoughts, please shoot me a comment, and hopefully I will see you in next week's video. Thanks so much.